1 year ago, the Divine Awakening system appeared in the sky above every city on Earth simultaneously. Not a news broadcast. Not a government announcement. Not a signal that anyone detected before it happened. It simply appeared, a vast luminous interface visible to every human being on the planet at the same moment, written in every language simultaneously, readable in the periphery of vision even to people who were asleep, as if it had always been there and had only now decided to make itself known. The message was brief. It said, the planet has entered a new developmental phase. Territories will be assigned. Abilities will awaken. Build what you can sustain. Then it disappeared. What followed was 36 hours of global chaos that historians were already calling the transition, as if giving it a clean single word made it more manageable than it actually had been. In those 36 hours, approximately 14% of the human population experienced an awakening event. A physical sensation described by most people who went through it as something between electricity and recognition, like a part of your body you had never been able to move suddenly becoming available. An ability manifested. The system registered it. A classification appeared in your field of vision if you looked for it, floating in that same peripheral space the original message had occupied, quiet and persistent and entirely yours. The other 86% felt nothing. That division, it turned out, was the most significant social event in recorded human history. More significant than the territory assignments that followed. More significant than the monsters that began appearing at the territory boundaries shortly after. The division between the 14% who had awakened and the 86% who had not was the fault line that everything else was built on, and in the 12 months since the transition, the institutions and economies and social structures that had formed along that fault line were already as entrenched as if they had existed for generations. Cale had been 17 when it happened. He had been in the group home where he had lived since he was 9, in a room he shared with 2 other boys, lying on a bed that was functional and nothing else, when the original system message appeared. He had read it in that peripheral vision space and felt the specific quality of someone reading something they did not yet have the framework to process, and then he had gone back to sleep because there was nothing else immediately useful to do. The awakening came 3 hours later. Not dramatically. He had not convulsed or glowed or woken up screaming the way some of the accounts described. He had simply opened his eyes in the dark and felt it, the electricity and recognition combination, moving through him from the center outward, and when it was done he lay still for a while feeling the new shape of himself, the thing that had been there and was now available, and then he sat up and looked for the classification in his peripheral vision. Pressure tolerance, the system said. Passive ability. Defensive classification. Current output capacity at standard atmospheric conditions. Minimal. He had looked at that for a long time. Then he had gone back to sleep again, because there was still nothing immediately useful to do, and useful was the framework Cale had always organized his decisions around when no other framework was available. In the 12 months between his awakening and the Great Territory Ceremony, the world had done what worlds did with new information. It had built structures around it. The awakened population had been assessed, ranked, categorized, recruited, sold to, advised, exploited, celebrated, and dismissed, often all within the same week, by the institutions that had immediately understood that the transition represented the largest transfer of power and resources in human history and had moved to position themselves accordingly. The territory development industry had emerged almost overnight. Companies that had been in mining, construction, resource extraction, and military logistics had pivoted immediately, hiring awakened individuals with the right ability classifications for territorial management and defense and development. Guilds had formed to organize the awakened population for monster suppression within territory boundaries. Financial instruments had appeared to fund territory development in exchange for future resource rights. A secondary market for ability enhancement resources had grown so fast that regulatory frameworks had not caught up with it and probably would not catch up for years. And at the center of all of it was the territory assignment system, the mechanism by which the Divine Awakening system distributed the planet's surface and subsurface geography among the awakened population. The system had been doing this in waves over the 12 months since the transition, assigning territories progressively as the awakened population was registered and assessed. Each assignment ceremony was a public event. The system required it. The assignment was displayed publicly as part of its registration function, visible above the recipient's head in the arena space for every attendee to see, and this requirement had been embraced by the territory development industry with the specific enthusiasm of people who understood that public visibility was the mechanism by which investment interest was generated. The Great Territory Ceremony was the final assignment event. It covered the last cohort of registered awakened individuals who had not yet received a territory, a mixed group of late registrants, delayed assessments, and individuals whose ability classifications had required extended evaluation before the system produced an assignment recommendation. Approximately 300 people. The ceremony was held in the Varlan Arena, the largest indoor venue in the city, which seated 12,000 and had been sold to capacity because the Territory Development Industry's event management wing had marketed the Great Territory Ceremony as the last opportunity to identify untapped territory holders before the global assignment process was complete. Cale arrived at the arena an hour before the ceremony began. He had taken the bus because he did not have a car and the group home was in the Eastern District where transit was reliable enough if you planned for the delays. He was 18 now, a year past his awakening, a year past the single delayed assessment that had produced the pressure tolerance classification and the specific quality of silence from the assessors that followed it. He had been re-evaluated twice in the 12 months since, at the group home's arrangement, because the group home's director had understood that a territory assignment could represent a significant change in a resident's circumstances and had wanted to ensure the assessment was accurate. Both re-evaluations had produced the same result. Pressure tolerance. Passive. Defensive. Minimal output at standard atmospheric conditions. The third assessor had explained it to him with the careful gentleness of someone delivering information they knew was disappointing. She said the ability was real and was functioning correctly. She said the minimal output at standard conditions was not a malfunction or an incomplete awakening. It was simply the nature of a passive defensive ability whose function was environmental adaptation, and in an environment where the existing conditions were not significantly elevated beyond standard baseline, the adaptation response had minimal opportunity to express. She said it was the kind of ability that had specific use cases and that territory development specialists would be better positioned than she was to advise on what those use cases might be. He had thanked her and gone back to the group home and thought about the specific use cases for a long time without arriving at a clear answer. The arena was already full when he arrived. Not full of the 300 ceremony recipients. Full of everyone else. The 12,000 seats were occupied by territory development investors, guild recruitment representatives, families of ceremony recipients who had pre-purchased preference packages with the ceremony management organization, and the general public who followed the territory assignment events the way previous generations had followed sporting events, with the same investment in outcomes, the same analysis of prospects, the same enthusiastic willingness to celebrate some results and dismiss others. He found his seat in the recipient section, a designated area near the center of the floor space below the main seating banks. The recipients sat in chairs arranged in 10 rows of 30, and around them the arena rose in tiers toward the ceiling. He sat in his assigned chair and looked up at the seating banks and thought that 12,000 people was a specific kind of audience, not large in the way of some events, but large enough that the sound it produced when it moved or reacted was something you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. The other recipients were doing what people did before events began. Some were talking to the people beside them. Some were looking at their phones. Some were doing the particular stillness of people who had been preparing for this for a long time and were now in the transition between preparation and event, where there was nothing left to do but wait and where waiting was genuinely difficult. He looked at what they had. It was visible if you knew how to look. Not in the way of ability classification displays, which were private and personal and not publicly readable without specific equipment. In the way of preparation. Some of the recipients had company representatives sitting in the donor seats directly adjacent to the recipient floor, close enough to maintain visual contact, close enough to pass a message or a document if the assignment result warranted immediate conversation. Some of them had the particular posture of people who had been extensively briefed, who had prepared for multiple assignment scenarios, who knew what they were going to say to the development representatives after the ceremony regardless of which territory they received. Some of them had equipment cases in the storage area behind the recipient section. Development starter kits. Resource analysis tools. The beginning of what you needed to start building something from whatever you received. Cale had a change of clothes and the bus pass back to the Eastern District. He was not bitter about this. He had thought carefully about whether he was bitter about it and had concluded that he was not, which was different from concluding that it was fair. It was not fair. The preparation available to different recipients had nothing to do with the ability of the people preparing and everything to do with the circumstances surrounding them, and the circumstances surrounding Cale had not included a family who understood territory development or a community that had resources to invest in his prospects or advisors who had sat down with him and walked through the scenarios. What he had was 12 months of reading everything publicly available about the territory development system and the ability classification framework and the kinds of territories that had been assigned in previous ceremonies, and he had read all of it carefully because reading carefully was the thing available to him and he had always worked with what was available. The ceremony began. The Arena MC, a professional event host hired by the ceremony management organization, welcomed the 12,000 attendees with the practiced warmth of someone who had done many of these events and understood the entertainment framework he was operating within. He described the ceremony's historical significance, the final wave of the global assignment process, the closing of the initial transition period. He described what the territory development industry had produced in the 12 months since the first ceremonies, the kingdoms and fortresses and resource territories that were already producing output and supporting populations and generating the kind of economic activity that previous generations would not have believed was achievable in a single year. Then the assignments began. The first recipient was called by name and walked to the designated floor space at the center of the recipient area. The system registered their presence and displayed the territory assignment above their head in a luminous interface visible throughout the arena. A forest territory in the Northern Highlands, existing lumber and water resources, defensible terrain. The arena responded with the sound of 12,000 people making the collective judgment that this was a good result, not spectacular, but solid, the kind of start that competent management could build into something real. The recipient walked back to their seat with the expression of someone whose preparation had covered this scenario and who was already moving to the next phase of the plan. Cale watched the next 46 assignments. He watched with the focused attention that he gave to anything he was trying to understand, which was the same quality of attention regardless of what he was looking at, a full and unhurried engagement with the information available. He noted which assignments produced strong arena reactions and which produced subdued ones. He noted the ability classifications of recipients whose territory assignments the MC highlighted as particularly well suited to their abilities, the specific logic of matching a water element ability with a coastal territory or a stone manipulation ability with a mountain region. He noted the lowest results, the frozen tundra assignments that the arena acknowledged with polite restraint, the salt flat territories that produced a brief moment of arena sympathy before moving on. Everything received was something. Barren land was something. A desert was something. An island with no existing resources was something. Something was the floor. Below the floor was what nobody expected to see in a territory assignment ceremony because the assignment system was supposed to match ability to viable territory and viable meant, in the standard framework, the possibility of development given sufficient effort and resources. He noticed when the arena's engagement changed. Not during any specific assignment but across the first 46. The audience's attention had a rhythm to it, a pattern of interest and processing and response that he could feel from where he was sitting. The good assignments produced immediate and loud response. The moderate assignments produced engaged but measured response. The poor assignments produced the particular quality of an audience that was paying respectful attention while simultaneously calculating how quickly the ceremony would move to the next name. He was sitting in the 47th chair. His name was called. He stood up and walked to the center floor space with the same quality of movement he brought to everything, unhurried, present, not performing anything in either direction. He stood in the designated spot and looked up at the arena once, a single sweep of the space, 12,000 people arranged in the tiers above him, the event lighting, the MC standing at a slight distance with the practiced neutral expression of someone waiting for the system to display before reacting. The system registered his presence. The territory assignment appeared above his head, the arena went quiet. Not the polite restrained quiet of a poor assignment. Not the transitional quiet of a moment before a reaction. A different quality of quiet entirely. The quiet that happened when 12,000 people encountered information simultaneously that did not fit any of the frameworks they had been using to process the previous 46 assignments. He read the display above his head by looking at the reflection in the polished floor surface below him, which showed the assignment text in reverse but fully readable to someone who had spent the past year reading everything available about the territory assignment system and had specifically prepared for the possibility that whatever was displayed would need to be read calmly in public. Territory assignment, Mariana Trench region, Pacific Ocean. Surface coordinates, classified. Territory depth, 3.8 to 4.2 kilometers below mean sea level. Territory area, 847 square kilometers. Existing resource assessment, unknown. Monster population, unknown. Development viability, unclassifiable. Standard awakener access probability, near zero. He stood with it for a moment. The quiet lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then someone in the upper tier laughed. It was not a mean laugh in the simple sense. It was the specific laugh of someone who had encountered something so far outside the expected range of outcomes that the gap between expectation and reality had produced an involuntary sound. It was the laugh of someone who had made a judgment and was expressing it and had not stopped to consider whether expressing it was appropriate, because 12,000 people around them were processing the same information and the laugh was the fastest available vehicle for the processing. Someone else joined it. Then a section. Then the laugh became a sound, not unified but present, distributed through the arena in the specific way of an audience that had arrived at a shared response. He stood in the center of it without moving. The MC recovered in the way that professional event hosts recovered, smoothly and quickly, redirecting the arena's attention and calling the next recipient's name, moving the ceremony forward because forward was always the solution to a moment that was not working. The next assignment appeared above the next recipient and it was a coastal territory with fishing rights and the arena's response shifted immediately into the warmer register of an assignment that worked. He walked back to his seat. The person in the chair beside him said nothing and looked at their phone. The person on his other side glanced at him once with an expression that had something in it that might have been sympathy and might have been relief that it had been him and not them. He sat down and looked at the MC and the ceremony and the ongoing progression of assignments and the arena's reactions and he thought about what had just happened with the full focused attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. He had received the ocean floor. 4 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean in an area that no development framework had ever considered classifiable because no standard awakener had ever successfully accessed it and come back. The assessment said near zero probability of access. It said unknown for everything that would normally determine whether a territory was worth attempting to develop. It had assigned this to him specifically, which meant the system had matched this territory to his specific ability classification, which meant that the system believed, in whatever logic governed its assignment decisions, that pressure tolerance was the ability classification appropriate for the Mariana Trench. He thought about this. He thought about it through the remainder of the ceremony, which covered 253 more assignments and produced several spectacular results that the arena responded to with the full vocal range of 12,000 people making the collective judgment that something extraordinary had happened. He thought about it while the ceremony concluded and the MC delivered a closing statement about the completion of the global assignment process and the beginning of the next phase of territorial development. He thought about it while the recipient section began to clear and the development representatives who had been positioned near the recipients of promising assignments began their post-ceremony conversations with the practiced speed of people who understood that the first conversation after an assignment was often the most important one. No one came to speak with him. He had not expected anyone to. He stood up when the section cleared enough to move comfortably, and he picked up his bag and he began walking toward the arena exit. The arena was still full of conversations and movement and the ambient energy of 12,000 people processing what they had witnessed and deciding what it meant for their various interests and investments. He was almost at the exit when his phone generated a notification. Not the standard system notification he had learned to recognize in the 12 months since his awakening. Something different. The notification interface was the same deep silver of the system rather than the standard display color, and the text that appeared when he opened it was not the standard classification format. Supplementary System Notification. Recipient, Kale. Territory, Mariana Trench Region. Classification Note. Pressure tolerance ability assessed as insufficient for territory access. Full ability classification review initiated at time of assignment. Review complete. Actual ability classification, pressure conversion. Full function description, environmental pressure received by the ability holder is automatically converted into structural energy at a conversion ratio of 1:1. Structural energy is directable, storable, and transferable to designated materials and constructions. Conversion capacity scales directly with incoming pressure. At sea level conditions conversion output, minimal. At territory depth conditions conversion output, operates at approximately 400 times surface capacity. Ability is the only recorded classification capable of sustained operation at territory depth. Territory assignment is matched. Note, initial assessment equipment was not calibrated to detect conversion function in low-pressure environments. Standard calibration does not include depth pressure simulation. He stopped walking. He was in the arena's exit corridor, people moving past him in both directions, the ambient sound of the post-ceremony crowd filling the space around him, and he stood still in the middle of it and read the notification a second time. Pressure conversion. Not tolerance. Not passive defensive function with minimal output. Conversion. A function that took whatever pressure was applied to him from the environment and turned it into structural energy that he could use, direct, store, and transfer. A function that scaled directly with the incoming pressure, meaning that the more pressure the environment applied, the more output the ability produced. A function that at the depth of his assigned territory operated at 400 times what it produced at the surface. He thought about the assessment equipment that had evaluated him 3 times in 12 months and produced the same wrong answer each time because it was not calibrated to detect the conversion function in low-pressure environments. He thought about the 3 assessors who had delivered the same result with careful gentleness, all of them looking at the same incomplete picture and telling him the most accurate thing they could with the data available to them, and all of them being wrong in the specific way that accurate information could be wrong when the measurement tool was measuring the wrong thing that he thought about the arena. The laugh. He stood in the exit corridor and thought about all of it for approximately 30 seconds. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked out of the arena. The city was its ordinary self outside, the afternoon light unremarkable, the street traffic following its patterns, the buildings performing their usual function of being buildings. He walked to the bus stop and waited for the bus with the patience of someone for whom waiting for buses was a long-practiced skill and thought about what came next. He had received the ocean floor. 4 kilometers down. Unknown resources. Unknown monster population. Development viability unclassifiable by any standard framework. Near zero access probability for a standard awakener. He was not a standard awakener. He was the only awakener in the world with the pressure conversion classification. He was the only person whose ability became 400 times more powerful at the exact depth his territory existed at. He was the only person who could go where his territory was and come back. The bus arrived. He got on, found a seat, looked out the window at the city moving past, and began working through the practical questions in the order that they needed to be worked through. Not the grand strategic questions. Not what his territory could eventually become or what the ocean floor might contain or what the people at the ceremony would think when they found out they had been wrong about what they were laughing at. Those questions existed and he would get to them. But the first questions were the practical ones. How did you get to the bottom of the ocean? What did you need to survive there before your ability was operating at full capacity? How long would the descent take, and what would the intermediate pressure levels feel like, and at what depth would the conversion function become sufficient to sustain him without additional equipment? He thought through these questions for the duration of the bus ride, which was 40 minutes, and by the time the bus reached the Eastern District stop he had a rough sequence of priorities and a list of things he needed to find out before he could build a plan from the sequence. He got off the bus and walked the 4 blocks to the group home. The group home's director was in the front office, and she saw him come in, and she came to the door of the office with the expression of someone who had watched the ceremony's broadcast and had something to say but was not certain how to say it. He told her he was fine before she could start. She said she was not sure fine was the right word for the situation. He said he had received some additional information after the ceremony that changed the picture significantly, and he was going to need to use the group home's library resources and internet connection for the next few weeks for research. He said he would explain more when the research was further along. She looked at him for a moment. She said okay. He said thank you and went to the library room and sat down at one of the computers and began researching the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, the pressure differential at 4 kilometers of ocean depth, the existing technology for deep-sea operations, what it cost, what was available without institutional backing, and what could theoretically be built by one person with limited resources and an ability that the entire assessment apparatus of the 12-month-old territory development industry had completely failed to correctly identify. The library room was quiet. He worked until the group home's lights-out policy required him to stop, and then he lay in his room in the dark and thought about the laugh, which had been the sound of 12,000 people making a judgment about him that was going to be wrong in a specific and complete way, and about the 400 times multiplier, which was what his ability became in the place they had laughed about him receiving. He was not angry. He was something more useful than angry. He was patient in the way that people were patient when they understood that what they were waiting for was already there, and the only question was how long it would take to reach it. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow the research continued. The ocean floor was waiting. The research took 3 weeks, not 3 weeks of finding answers. 3 weeks of finding the right questions, which was the prior work that most people skipped because it was slower and less satisfying than the feeling of having answers, and which was also the work that determined whether the answers you eventually found were the ones that actually mattered. Cale had always been better at the prior work than the satisfying part that he started with what was known publicly about the Mariana Trench. The geography first, because geography was the fixed element that everything else built from. The Mariana Trench was the deepest oceanic trench on the planet, located in the western Pacific Ocean east of the Mariana Islands, running approximately 2,500 kilometers in length and averaging 69 kilometers in width. Its maximum known depth was the Challenger Deep, approximately 11 kilometers below sea level at its lowest measured point. His assigned territory was in the region but not at the absolute extreme, beginning at 3.8 kilometers depth and extending to 4.2 kilometers, covering 847 square kilometers of ocean floor. He mapped this against what the system notification had told him: 400 times surface capacity at territory depth. He ran the calculation the other way, which was more useful. At what depth did his conversion function become sufficient to sustain him without equipment? He did not know the answer to this because he did not yet know the baseline output of the conversion function at surface conditions, and the only way to know that was to test it, which required producing measurable pressure and observing the output. He added this to the test list and kept reading. The pressure at 4 kilometers of ocean depth was approximately 400 atmospheres. 1 atmosphere was the standard pressure at sea level, the pressure the human body was designed for. The pressure at which his ability produced minimal output. 400 atmospheres was 400 times that. The conversion ratio in the system notification was stated as 1:1, meaning that 400 atmospheres of incoming pressure became 400 units of structural energy output per unit of time. He did not yet know what a unit of structural energy corresponded to in practical terms, which was one of the fundamental things he needed to figure out, but the ratio told him something important. The scaling was linear, not diminishing. It did not plateau. The deeper he went the more he produced, in direct proportion, which meant the relationship between depth and ability output was a straight line rather than a curve. This mattered for planning because it meant the territory's most productive region was also its deepest region, and a straight-line scaling relationship meant that any progress downward translated directly into increased capacity with no threshold effects and no points of diminishing return to plan around. He found the existing research on deep-sea exploration and read all of it that was publicly available, which was substantial. Humans had been reaching the deep ocean since the 1950s with improving technology. The Challenger Deep had been reached multiple times. The research submersibles used for this work were extraordinary pieces of engineering, designed to withstand pressures that would crush anything not specifically built for the task, and they cost millions of dollars to build and hundreds of thousands of dollars to operate per dive. This was the technology baseline for reaching the depths of his territory if he were approaching the problem the standard way. He was not approaching it the standard way. He was approaching it as a person whose ability, properly understood, converted the ocean's pressure from a threat into a resource. The question was not whether he could withstand the journey down. The ability handled that by definition, the question was how he got there without the ability's protection during the portion of the descent before the pressure was sufficient to make the conversion function adequate for sustaining him. He worked out the math. At sea level his ability produced minimal output. The notification had said this. Minimal was not zero, which was a meaningful distinction. Minimal meant something small but real. He needed to know what minimal was in absolute terms to know at what point during a descent the conversion function would transition from insufficient to sufficient. The gradient of the ocean's pressure increase with depth was approximately 1 additional atmosphere per 10 meters. Minimal becoming sufficient would happen at some point between 0 meters and the depth at which 400 atmospheres produced what the notification described as 400 times surface capacity. If minimal at surface was 1 unit, then sufficient might be at 10 units, or 50 units, or 200 units, and the depth at which he reached it would be 10 meters, or 50 meters, or 200 meters respectively. The uncertainty was significant enough that planning around it was the wrong approach. What he needed was a vehicle that could take him from the surface to the depth at which the conversion function made a vehicle unnecessary, and the vehicle needed to be functional down to whatever that depth turned out to be. He started reading about the practical engineering of pressure vessels. This was where the research shifted from background reading to specific technical study and where the 3 weeks became something different from a literature review. He was reading engineering documentation, material specifications, construction tolerances, the specific relationship between material properties and pressure resistance at depth. He was not an engineer. He had not studied engineering and had no training in the field and was not going to pretend otherwise in his thinking. What he had was the ability to read carefully and to distinguish between the parts of a technical document that were fundamental principles and the parts that were specific implementation details, and to hold the fundamental principles as the things that could not be compromised and treat the implementation details as the space where resourcefulness could operate. The fundamental principles for a descent vehicle were these. The hull material had to be capable of withstanding the target pressure. The internal volume had to maintain a breathable atmosphere throughout the descent. The descent mechanism had to be controllable so that the descent rate could be managed. The ascent mechanism had to be capable of returning the vehicle to the surface from the target depth. He thought about each of these against the constraint he was actually working within, which was not millions of dollars and institutional backing but the resources available to a person who had aged out of the group home system in 6 months and had spent 12 months watching territory development resources flow to every classification except his and had consequently saved every dollar that was savable from the part-time work the group home arrangement allowed residents to take during the final year of their placement. He had a little under $4,000. $4,000 was not what millions of dollars was. But $4,000 and the specific ability to convert incoming pressure into structural energy that could be applied to the reinforcement of materials and structures was a different set of inputs than the standard engineering problem, and he spent the second week thinking through the specific difference. A standard pressure vessel was built to passively resist the ocean's pressure through the inherent properties of its construction materials. The engineering was designed to make the hull strong enough on its own that the pressure could not compromise it. His ability offered a different approach. A hull that was built to adequate but not extreme passive resistance standards, combined with an active reinforcement layer that used his conversion output to supplement the hull's passive resistance throughout the descent, would require significantly less material quality and construction precision than a passive resistance-only approach. He could use conversion output to make a cheaper hull perform beyond its material rating. He spent the third week on the specific materials and construction approach that this implied, reading about the properties of the materials that were within his budget range, working through the geometry of a hull that minimized surface area relative to internal volume to reduce the total structural load the conversion reinforcement needed to handle, thinking through the descent and ascent mechanism with the same constraint-aware approach. By the end of the third week he had a design. Not a complete engineered design with specifications that a professional would recognize as construction-ready. A design in the sense of a clear enough picture of what he was building to know what materials he needed, what tools he needed, and in what sequence the construction needed to proceed. The difference between that and a professional specification was knowledge and equipment that he was going to have to acquire as the work progressed, which was uncomfortable as a starting position but was the starting position available. He started building. The group home director had a question about this when he requested use of the home's maintenance workshop space for an extended period. She stood in the doorway of the workshop looking at the materials he had begun accumulating in the corner and she asked him what he was building. He said a descent vehicle. She said a descent vehicle for what? He said for reaching the floor of the ocean territory the system had assigned him. She was quiet for a moment. He said he understood it sounded unlikely. He said the ability classification that the assessment system had assigned him was incorrect and that the correct classification had implications for the assigned territory that made the descent viable in a way that the standard assessment would not have predicted. She looked at the materials in the corner. She said the last assessment had said minimal output. He said the last assessment had been using equipment not calibrated for the ability's actual function. She said what was the actual function? He said pressure conversion. He explained it. He explained the 400 times multiplier at depth. He explained the descent vehicle logic, the way the conversion output could supplement the hull's passive resistance, the way the ability's power scaled with the exact environmental conditions that existed at his territory's depth. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she needed to tell him something about his placement timeline. He said he knew. He had 6 months left in the group home arrangement before the standard aging out process concluded his placement. He said 6 months was the timeline he was working within. She said and if the vehicle is not complete by then. He said it would be complete before then. He said he had planned for 12 weeks of construction assuming work in the evenings and on weekends around the group home's schedule requirements, which left approximately a month of margin within the 6-month window. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she would talk to the maintenance supervisor about the workshop space. He said thank you. She said she was not going to pretend she was not worried about this. He said that was reasonable. She said she was also not going to pretend she did not think he was probably right about the ability. She said in 12 months she had watched him read everything he could find about the territory development system with the specific attention of someone who was preparing for something, and she said she had been concerned the preparation was going to amount to nothing because the assessment result was what it was. She said this new information changed her picture of the situation considerably. He said he appreciated her saying that. She said be careful building whatever this is. He said he would. She went back to the front office and he went back to the corner of the workshop and began organizing the materials into the sequence in which they would be needed. The construction took 11 weeks. It was not smooth. Nothing that was built by one person who was not a professional builder using materials constrained by a $4,000 budget across 11 weeks of evening and weekend work was going to be smooth. There were problems that required solutions that required additional research that required adjustments to the design and sometimes adjustments to the already completed portions of the build. There were failures. A hull segment that cracked during a pressure test he ran at the depth of a local reservoir had to be rebuilt. A descent mechanism component that he had designed around a specific part's availability was no longer available from the supplier he had identified and required a substitute that changed the geometry of the mechanism and required 2 weeks of redesign. He worked through all of it with the patience that was his most reliable tool. He tested the conversion function during the reservoir test, which was the first time he had been in a high-pressure environment since the awakening. The reservoir was not deep enough to produce the kind of pressure differential that would make a significant difference in the ability's output. The deepest accessible point was approximately 40 meters producing roughly 4 additional atmospheres above surface baseline. But it was enough to confirm what the system notification had described. At 40 meters the conversion function produced measurably more output than at the surface. Not dramatic output. A warmth in his chest and his hands that was distinct from the surface baseline, an awareness of something available that had not been available before. He pressed his palm against the hull segment he had brought for the test and focused the output toward the material and watched the material change under his hand. The material did not visually change. That was not how the function worked at this level of output. What changed was what the material could do. When he put pressure on the reinforced section and the unreinforced section of the same hull piece, the difference in resistance was measurable. The reinforced section handled the load in a way that the material's passive properties alone should not have supported at its rating. It was working. He came back from the reservoir test with wet clothes and a confirmation that the fundamental logic of the design was sound, and he spent the evening adjusting the design parameters to account for what the test had actually shown rather than what he had projected, which were somewhat different numbers, and he went to sleep with the particular quality of someone who had just confirmed that the thing they have been building toward is real. The completion of the vehicle came on a Thursday evening in the 12th week. He stood in the workshop and looked at what he had built. It was not beautiful. He had not been optimizing for beauty. It was a cylinder approximately 2 meters in length and 1 meter in diameter, constructed from the highest pressure tolerance material his budget had allowed, with a single internal chamber sufficient for one person seated, a descent mechanism using a weighted ballast system for controlled downward movement and a ballast release for ascent, a viewport made from the most pressure-resistant transparent material available to him, and a life support system that would maintain breathable atmosphere for approximately 18 hours. The conversion reinforcement would begin supplementing the hull's passive resistance at depth. He had calculated, based on the reservoir test data and the linear scaling relationship, that somewhere between 200 and 400 meters the conversion output would become sufficient to handle the hull's structural load independently of the hull's passive properties. Below that depth the hull became progressively less important as the conversion output increased. By the time he reached 1 kilometer the hull's passive properties were largely irrelevant to the structural integrity of the vehicle. By the time he reached his territory's depth at 4 kilometers the hull was essentially decorative. He was not going to remove the hull. The hull was also the life support system's outer boundary and it would remain necessary for that function even at depth. He ran his hand along the cylinder's surface. He had built this in the maintenance workshop of a group home in the Eastern District with $4,000 and 11 weeks of evenings and weekends while the territory development industry invested millions into the ambitious developments of people whose ability classifications had made the assessors nod rather than go quiet. He thought about what was waiting 4 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean in his assigned territory. He thought about the mineral formations the system assessment had listed as unknown, which he interpreted as meaning that no standard assessment tool had ever reached his territory with sufficient resolution to produce a reading. Unknown was not empty. Unknown was what you called a territory that no instrument capable of reading it had ever visited. Unknown was the result of the assessment process acknowledging its own limitations, not the result of the assessment process confirming the absence of resources. He thought about the structures. He had not told anyone about the structures. He had not found references to them in any public research about the Mariana Trench region, which suggested either that they were genuinely not known to the surface world's existing documentation, or that the documentation was restricted in ways he had not been able to access, or that they were something the system's supplementary notification had shown him as a territory detail that was not part of the standard assignment documentation. The notification had not mentioned structures explicitly. What it had described was his ability and his territory and the match between them. But the system notification had given him a more complete picture of his territory than the standard assignment document, and one of the things that more complete picture contained was a topographical detail in the deep territory region that the standard document had listed as terrain feature unknown, and that the higher resolution notification data had shown as something with a geometry that natural ocean floor formations did not typically produce. He had been thinking about that geometry for 3 weeks. He had not shared the thinking with anyone because sharing the thinking required explaining the source, and explaining the source required explaining the full content of the supplementary notification, and he was not ready to explain the full content of the supplementary notification to anyone yet. Not because he was being secretive in the way of someone protecting an advantage. Because he did not yet understand it well enough to explain it accurately, and explaining things inaccurately was something he worked hard to avoid. The group home director came to the workshop door. She looked at the cylinder. She said it was smaller than she had expected. He said it only needed to carry one person. She said right. She said when was he planning to go? He said he had arranged transport for the vehicle to the coast for the following week. He had found a coastal access point that his research had identified as appropriate for an unassisted open water descent, which was a technical way of saying he needed a place to enter the ocean without going through a port authority or territory development company's infrastructure. He had identified one that was technically within the coordinates of the territory boundary's surface projection and that was accessible without requiring permissions he did not have. She said you researched where you could enter the ocean without anyone stopping you. He said yes. She said I see. He said the territory was legally assigned to him. The surface projection of the territory boundary was within his rights to access. He was not doing anything that his assignment rights did not cover. She said she knew that. She said she was just noting that he had planned this with a level of thoroughness that should not surprise her at this point but somehow still did. He said he had been preparing for a long time. She said she knew. She said she had watched him prepare. She said the thing she had not been sure about was whether the preparation was going to have anywhere to go. He said it had somewhere to go now. She looked at the cylinder again. She said she was going to say something and he could do with it whatever he thought was appropriate. He said okay. She said in 12 months of watching him prepare she had not once seen him perform confidence he did not have or competence he did not possess. She said he was the most honest person about his actual situation that she had encountered in many years of working with people in difficult circumstances. She said because of that she was going to say something she would not say to most people in his position, which was that she thought he was going to be all right. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said thank you. He said it simply, without performing anything around it. She said you're welcome. She said she was going to go make sure the transport arrangements were documented properly on the group home's side in case anyone official asked questions about a former resident and a descent vehicle later. He said that was probably wise. She went back to the front office. He turned back to the cylinder and ran through the final pre-transport checklist he had written out in the 3rd week and revised 6 times since. Life support system function, ballast weight calibration. Viewport seal integrity, descent rate mechanism, ascent release mechanism, internal communication equipment, which was a single waterproof radio unit capable of transmitting on the surface frequency range, and a logging system that would record all readings throughout the descent for later analysis. Everything checked that he sat down on the workshop floor beside the cylinder and let himself feel, briefly and completely, what was about to happen. The transport was in 4 days. The descent was a week after that. He was going to the ocean floor, not the way the territory development industry went places, with institutional backing and professional equipment and teams of people who had done it before. He was going the way he had done everything in his life that had been worth doing, which was by working with what was actually available to him rather than waiting for what should theoretically be available to him if circumstances had been different. And what was actually available to him was a conversion ability that became 400 times more powerful at 4 kilometers depth and an 11-week cylinder, and the patience to have figured out how to put those two things together into something that could get him there and back. That he sat with it for a while, then he stood up and began preparing the cylinder for transport. The coast was waiting. Below the coast, 4 kilometers down, everything else was waiting too. He had made the people in that arena go quiet once. He sealed the workshop and went to bed. Tomorrow the final preparations. Next week, the descent. The transport to the coast took 4 hours. He had rented a trailer for the cylinder, the smallest trailer available from the rental company in the Eastern District, and he drove it with the rented truck through the morning traffic on a Tuesday because Tuesday traffic was lighter than any other weekday, and he had planned the departure time around the traffic pattern the way he planned everything, by understanding the variables and choosing the configuration that produced the best outcome given the constraints available. The coastal access point was a stretch of shoreline on the outer edge of the territory boundary's surface projection, a location he had identified during the 3rd week of research as meeting 3 specific criteria. It was within the legal boundary of his assigned territory at the surface level, meaning he had the right to access it without Port Authority involvement. It was not serviced by any active commercial operation that would have staff or monitoring infrastructure present to observe what he was doing. And it had a slope into the water that would allow him to move the cylinder from the trailer to the waterline without equipment he did not have. He arrived at 6 in the morning. He worked alone. Moving the cylinder from the trailer to the waterline took 2 hours and was the most physically demanding thing he had done in the preparation period, the cylinder being significantly heavier than one person was designed to move efficiently across uneven coastal terrain. He used the mechanical advantage of the trailer's ramp and a system of rollers he had built specifically for this task, and he moved it in stages, each stage controlled and deliberate, the cylinder never at risk of going somewhere he had not chosen for it to go. At 8 in the morning the cylinder was at the waterline. He ran the final checklist. Life support system, functional. Ballast weight calibration, confirmed. Viewport seal integrity. Confirmed, the seal he had rebuilt after the initial failure test holding correctly under manual pressure application. Descent mechanism, functional, the ballast weight seated correctly in its release housing. Ascent mechanism, functional, the release trigger tested 3 times in the workshop and responding correctly each time. Internal communication equipment. Powered and transmitting on the surface frequency, confirmed by the handheld receiver he had left on the shore as a test unit before entering the cylinder. Logging system, active, recording from the moment of power on, timestamp confirmed. He looked at the ocean. The Pacific at this point on the coast was unremarkable in the way that open ocean was unremarkable from the surface, which was to say it was enormous and indifferent and gave no indication whatsoever of what existed 4 kilometers below its surface. The water was gray in the morning light with the specific gray of a sky that was overcast without being threatening. There was no wind. The surface was not flat but it was close to flat, the low swell moving in the particular rhythm of deep water that had nothing immediately disturbing it. He had done the preparation. He had built the vehicle. He had researched the variables and tested the critical functions and planned the sequence and identified the problems that had appeared and solved them. There was nothing left in the preparation category. What was left was the thing itself. He opened the hatch, lowered himself into the cylinder, and sealed it behind him. The interior was exactly the size he had designed it to be, which was sufficient and not comfortable, the kind of space that was appropriate for its function without concern for how it felt to occupy it. He settled into the seated position, confirmed the interior systems were operational from the inside panel, and activated the descent mechanism. The cylinder moved into the water. The first thing he felt was the cold. The coastal Pacific in this region ran cold regardless of season, and the cylinder's insulation was functional but not extraordinary, and the cold was present as a quality of the air inside the vehicle within the first minutes of submersion, not dangerous, not the kind of cold that required immediate response, but present and specific in the way that cold was specific when it came from deep water rather than from surface weather. The second thing he felt was the pressure. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The ocean's pressure increased with depth at the rate of approximately 1 additional atmosphere per 10 meters of descent, which meant the first 10 meters of the descent added 1 additional atmosphere to the baseline, a change too small to feel physically in any significant way. But the ability registered it. Whatever the ability's awareness was, that specific quality of knowing that had been present since the awakening in a way that was distinct from ordinary physical sensation, it registered the change immediately and produced a response that was not dramatic and was also not nothing. He noted the depth from the logging system readout on the interior panel and noted the corresponding ability response and began the record he intended to maintain throughout the descent. 20 meters. The conversion function was producing something measurably above its surface baseline. Still minimal in absolute terms. But the direction of change was confirmed from the first 20 meters. 50 meters. The output had increased in proportion to the depth, the linear scaling relationship holding exactly as the system notification had described. He felt it as a warmth in his chest and his hands, not heat, a warmth, the specific quality of a resource becoming available rather than a temperature change. He directed a small portion of the output toward the whole surface as he had practiced in the reservoir and felt the whole respond in the way it had responded there, the material's effective structural properties increasing beyond what the material's passive rating supported. 100 meters. The proportional increase continued. The cold from outside had stabilized within the cylinder, the life support system maintaining its function correctly. The external environment was no longer visible through the viewport. The coastal light that had filtered through the water from the surface had diminished progressively as he descended, the blue becoming deeper and the ambient illumination thinner, and at 100 meters the light was present but thin in the way of something that was approaching its limit rather than still in its range. 150 meters. The balance shifted. He felt it happen and he had prepared for it intellectually and the preparation was correct and the experience of it was still different from the preparation. The conversion output crossed a threshold at 150 meters where it was no longer supplementing the hull's passive resistance but exceeding it, the output providing more structural support than the hull's material properties were providing on their own. The hull was still there, still functioning, still doing its job. But the job had changed. The hull was now the secondary element and the conversion output was the primary element and the cylinder's integrity depended on both but depended more on the conversion than on the material. He had designed for this to happen somewhere between 100 and 400 meters and it had happened at 150. The earlier threshold than the projected range meant his conversion baseline was slightly higher than the reservoir test had suggested, which was information he noted and updated in the running log. 300 meters. The question of whether the descent was viable had stopped being a question. At 300 meters and the corresponding conversion output level, the structural load on the hull was being handled by the ability with enough margin that equipment failure in the hull's passive structure, while it would require response, would not constitute an immediate crisis. He was not at a depth where the conversion could replace the hull's function entirely, but he was at a depth where the hull's failure mode had shifted from catastrophic to manageable. He exhaled slowly and deliberately. He was going down. The light died at approximately 800 meters. Not gradually in the way it had been fading, a progressive dimming that gave the eyes time to adjust and the mind time to process the change. It stopped. The ambient illumination that had been filtering down from the surface reached the point where the ocean's depth had absorbed it completely and the viewport showed nothing. He activated the external lamp, a single powerful beam mounted at the front of the cylinder that he had built specifically for this, and the lamp cut through the dark in the specific way that artificial light cut through absolute darkness, revealing a narrow cone of visibility and making everything outside the cone feel closer and more present than it would have in ambient light. What the lamp showed him moved. Not the water, which moved in the specific currents of deep ocean in ways his instruments were registering but which were not visible as movement at this scale. Things in the water moved. Creatures. He had read about the deep ocean's biological population extensively during the research period and he had understood intellectually that the deep ocean was not empty, that the darkness below the photic zone was inhabited by organisms adapted to pressures and temperatures and the complete absence of solar energy in ways that surface life was not, and the intellectual understanding was not the same as watching something move through the lamp beam 400 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean in the dark. He watched. What moved through the lamp beam were things that his surface-trained pattern recognition struggled to categorize. Not because they were frightening in the simple sense. Because they were adapted. Every feature, every structural characteristic visible in the fraction of a second the lamp illuminated them as they passed, was an adaptation to an environment that operated on completely different principles than the environment his pattern recognition had been built for. They were not wrong. They were right for where they were. The wrongness was in the tool he was using to look at them, not in the things themselves. He filed this away. He was going to need a different tool eventually. 500 meters. The conversion output at this depth was producing something that he could describe accurately as substantial. Not the warmth and awareness of the shallower depths. A presence, a resource that was available and directable and growing with each additional 10 meters of depth in the exact proportion the system notification had described. He pressed his hand against the interior hull surface and directed a portion of the output toward the material and felt what the material did in response at this output level, which was different from what it had done at the reservoir and different again from what it had done at 150 meters. The material was not just stronger. It was more. Whatever the conversion output did to materials it contacted, the effect was not simple reinforcement. It was transformation. The material's properties were shifting in ways that the surface world's material science had no category for because the surface world had never applied conversion output at this level to any material. He noted this carefully and noted also that the transformation appeared to be permanent, which was information that had significant implications for everything he was planning to build on the floor. 700 meters. 1 kilometer. At 1 kilometer the conversion output crossed another threshold that was qualitatively different from the threshold at 150 meters. At 150 meters the conversion had taken the lead structural role. At 1 kilometer the hull became structurally irrelevant in a way that was not just a matter of degree but of kind. The pressure at 1 kilometer of depth was approximately 100 atmospheres. 100 atmospheres of incoming pressure being converted at a 1-to-1 ratio meant 100 units of structural output being generated continuously, and 100 units of structural output directed at the hull meant the hull was being held together by the conversion and the hull's own material properties were a rounding error in the calculation. He was not being protected by the cylinder at this depth. He was protecting the cylinder. He sat with this understanding for a moment. The ocean was pressing against the cylinder from every direction with 100 times the force it pressed against everything at sea level, and the cylinder was intact because he was inside it, not because of what the cylinder was made of. The cylinder's purpose had shifted from keeping him alive to keeping the life support system contained and operational. Those were different purposes, and the second one required the cylinder to remain intact but did not require the cylinder to be a pressure vessel in any meaningful engineering sense. He continued down. The creatures in the lamp beam changed with depth. Not just in species, though they changed in species, but in quality. The adaptations became more extreme with depth in the way that anything adapted to an extreme environment became more extreme as the environment became more extreme. At 1,000 meters the things passing through his lamp were built for pressures that would destroy the most sophisticated surface diving equipment. At 1,500 meters the scale of the organisms changed. Larger. Not in the way of surface ocean creatures where size was a function of ecological role and evolutionary history. In the way of something that had occupied an environment with certain available resources for a very long time and had grown to match those resources. He watched carefully and noted carefully and did not stop moving. 2 kilometers. 3. At 3 kilometers the conversion output was 300 times what it produced at the surface, and the difference between 300 times and the surface baseline was not something he had language for because the language would have needed to come from an experience that did not exist in anyone's record. He was the only person who had ever been at 3 kilometers of ocean depth with this ability active. There was no reference. He built the reference as he went. At 3.8 kilometers the system registered something. Not a threat alert. A boundary registration. His territory began at 3.8 kilometers depth, and the system, which had been running its standard monitoring functions throughout the descent, produced a notification at the moment he crossed the upper boundary of his assigned territory. The notification said, "Territory boundary crossed, entering assigned domain, full system functions now active. He had not known the system would do this. The full system functions that became active at the territory boundary were different from the monitoring functions that had been running during the descent. The resource assessment function activated and immediately began building a picture of the territory's composition that was more detailed and more comprehensive than anything the standard surface assessment had been able to produce, because the standard surface assessment had never had an active ability holder inside the territory to serve as the assessment's anchor point. The monitoring coverage expanded to the full territorial extent. A mapping function initialized and began constructing a three-dimensional model of the territory's physical layout from the sensor data the system was pulling through his proximity. He watched the map build in his peripheral vision as he descended the final 200 meters. At 4.2 kilometers the map showed him the floor. He landed. The cylinder settled on the sediment of the ocean floor of his territory with a gentleness that was partly the descent mechanism's controlled ballast function and partly the conversion output stabilizing the final approach, and for a moment he held completely still inside the cylinder and felt what it felt like to have arrived. Then he looked through the viewport. He had read everything publicly available about the Mariana Trench region's geology and biology. He had looked at every photograph and every video recording that the surface world's deep ocean research programs had produced of trench environments. He had built a picture from all of that material of what the floor of a deep ocean trench looked like, the sediment plains, the rock formations, the hydrothermal activity, the particular visual character of a place that existed beyond the reach of sunlight and at pressures that the surface world had only recently developed tools to visit. What the lamp showed him through the viewport was not that picture. Not because it was dramatically different in every visible element. In some elements it matched the picture well enough. Sediment, yes. Rock formations, yes. The specific darkness of an environment where the lamp's reach was the only illumination available, yes. What was wrong with the picture was the geometry. Natural formations in deep ocean environments were not geometric. They were the result of geological processes and biological accumulation and sediment deposition and the specific physics of how the deep ocean shaped the material it contained, and the result of those processes was complex and varied and did not repeat itself in the specific regular patterns that geometry required. What the lamp showed him through the viewport had repetition in it. Had pattern in it. Had the specific quality of regularity that natural processes did not produce. He needed to see more than the viewport allowed. He opened the exterior lamp to its maximum beam width, trading depth of illumination for breadth of coverage, and the picture that assembled from the wider view changed everything he had been looking at. The mineral formations closest to the landing site were dense. Not in the way of geological density but in the way of something concentrated in a specific location rather than distributed randomly across the available space. The system's resource assessment function was reading them as he looked, and the output the assessment produced appeared in his peripheral vision with a notation he had never seen in any territory development documentation. Deep Origin Class 1. He cross-referenced the notation with the system's classification database, and the cross-reference produced a resource description that he read 3 times to confirm he was reading it correctly. Rare earth compounds in configurations that standard surface mining had never documented. Metallic alloys whose structural properties exceeded anything the surface world's materials market currently produced. Compressed by millions of years of ocean floor pressure into densities that made surface concentrations of the same base materials look like diffuse background noise. The system's quantity assessment function attempted to estimate the resource volume in the visible area and produced a notation of its own, exceeding surface classification parameters, new classification applied. He moved the lamp and found the vents. The geothermal vents were not the small formations that the surface world's deep ocean research had documented in other trench regions. They were larger in scale and more numerous in distribution, and the energy output the system registered from the nearest cluster was in a range that the system's energy assessment function flagged with the same exceeding surface classification parameters notation it had applied to the mineral assessment. He looked at the numbers and thought about the territory development industry's ongoing interest in renewable high-density energy sources and the conversations he had followed in the publicly available territory development literature about the scarcity of truly high-output geological energy sources among the assigned territories. No assigned territory had anything close to what his monitoring was showing him. In the immediate landing area, he had not moved the cylinder more than 50 meters from the landing point. He moved the lamp again. The structures were at the edge of the lamp's extended beam range, far enough that the illumination was thin and the detail was incomplete, but present and clear enough that his earlier assessment from the system's supplementary notification data was confirmed. The geometry was wrong for natural formations. It was wrong in the specific way that it was right for constructed formations. Consistent angles. Deliberate spacing between structural elements. The specific relationship between scale and proportion that things built by something with an understanding of structural load and environmental stress produced. Whatever had built them understood what it was building. The system's assessment of the structures produced a material classification it created specifically for the occasion, deep origin structure class unknown. The surface world had no equivalent and the system had no existing entry in its database that matched what its sensors were reading from the construction material. He sat inside the cylinder at 4 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean and looked at what his territory contained and understood for the first time in a way that the surface preparation had only approximated why the system had matched this territory to this ability. Not because the ability could survive at this depth. Because what was at this depth required the ability in a way that went beyond survival. The resource assessment, the energy potential, the structures, all of it was here and had been here and would have remained here, producing nothing and reaching nothing, without someone whose ability could operate at this depth. The territory had been waiting not for any awakened person but for the specific classification that could do what he could do at the depth where all of this existed. The system had not given him the worst assignment. The system had given him the only assignment that was his. He opened the exterior storage compartment of the cylinder and began removing the construction materials he had brought for the first session. He had planned for 3 hours of construction work at the floor, which would leave him enough life support margin for the ascent plus a safety buffer, and he had planned the specific sequence of construction based on the highest priority need, which was a sealed chamber that would allow him to spend time in the territory without the cylinder's life support constraints on future visits. He directed the conversion output toward the construction materials. It was different from the reservoir. At the reservoir the output had been 4 additional atmospheres above baseline, enough to demonstrate the function's existence and confirm the linear scaling, but not enough to show what the function actually was in its operational environment. At 4 kilometers and 400 atmospheres the output was not a warmth and an awareness. It was a presence. Substantial and specific and completely available in the way that a tool was available when it was the right tool for the material it was working on. The materials he had brought were the same materials he had sourced within his budget constraints on the surface. At the surface they were what they were, capable of what their specifications described, no more. Under full-depth conversion output they became something different. He pressed his hands against the first structural element and directed the output into the material and felt the material change under his contact, and the change the system registered was a new property classification that the surface world's material database had never assigned to this material type. He built. He had never built anything before in the sense of constructing a physical structure. The 11 weeks of cylinder construction had given him a working relationship with tools and materials and the process of making one thing fit correctly with another thing, but building a cylinder was not building a chamber, and building a chamber on the floor of the ocean was not building anything he had done before. What he had was the conversion output and the careful attention he brought to everything and the specific advantage of building with materials that were responding to his ability in ways that exceeded their surface specifications, which meant that the margin between adequate and failure was larger at this depth than it would have been in any surface construction context. He worked for 3 hours. What he built in 3 hours was a sealed chamber 2 meters by 3 meters in internal dimensions with a ceiling height sufficient for a person to stand upright in, connected to the cylinder by a pressure transfer corridor that allowed him to move from the cylinder's life support environment into the chamber without exposure to the exterior ocean pressure. The chamber walls had been processed through full-depth conversion output, and the system registered them with a property classification it created for the purpose: deep origin processed, structural integrity exceeding parametric assessment range. He stood inside the finished chamber. The walls he had built held the ocean out. Not because the material he had brought was capable of that task at this depth in its surface state, because it was not, but because what the material had become after 3 hours of conversion output processing was not what it had been when he brought it down. The material had been transformed. Permanently. Whatever the conversion output did to materials it contacted at this depth, the effect remained after the contact ended. He removed his hands from the wall, and the wall stayed exactly what the conversion output had made it. He would not need to rebuild this. He could return to it. He went back through the connection corridor to the cylinder and began the ascent. The ascent was quieter than the descent in the way that return journeys were often quieter than outward ones, the novelty of the experience having shifted into a kind of familiarity that left more of the mind available for the thinking the experience produced rather than the processing of the experience itself. He ascended through the 4 kilometers at the rate the ascent mechanism allowed, and he thought about what he had found and what he had built and what the combination of those two things meant for what came next. He reached the surface 2 hours and 40 minutes after beginning the ascent. He opened the hatch into the gray coastal morning and breathed the surface air and felt the specific quality of returning from a place that the surface world did not know existed. Not triumph. Something more fundamental than triumph. The feeling of having confirmed that the thing you were building toward was real and that the confirmation had come from contact with the thing itself rather than from any external source. He had found the territory. He had built the first structure in it. He was going back. The transport back to the Eastern District was quiet, and he spent the 4 hours making notes in the logging system about the construction materials and their responses to the conversion output at depth and what those responses implied for the next visit's construction priorities. By the time he reached the group home workshop, he had a revised construction sequence for visit 2 and a materials list that was different from the original plan in specific ways that the first visit's data justified. The group home director was in the workshop when he arrived. She looked at him. She said he was back. He said yes. She said how was it? He thought about the question for a moment. He said it was what he expected and more than he expected simultaneously. She said that is not a very informative answer. He said he knew. He said the informative version was going to take time to develop because what he had found was going to require careful thought before it could be described accurately, and he preferred to describe things accurately rather than quickly. She said that sounded like it went well. He said it went very well. She looked at him for a moment longer with the expression of someone who had watched a person prepare for something for a long time and was now watching them return from it and was trying to calibrate the correct response to a confirmation that the preparation was justified. She said she was glad. He said thank you. The second dive happened 6 days later. The third 12 days after the second. He was refining the descent vehicle with each return, making specific improvements based on what each dive had shown him about the performance variables, reducing the descent time and increasing the working time available at the floor. By the fourth dive the descent time was 3 hours and the available working time had increased from 3 hours to 5. By the sixth dive the descent time was 2.5 hours and the available working time was 6. The construction accumulated. The single sealed chamber became a 2-chamber facility on the third dive. A 3-chamber facility by the 5th. By the 8th dive the facility had 7 chambers connected by the conversion-reinforced corridors that the third dive had demonstrated were buildable in the available working time, and the 7-chamber facility had a power integration system that tapped into the nearest geothermal vent cluster and used the converted geothermal energy to maintain the facility's systems without requiring the cylinder's life support equipment as the primary support. He began bringing samples. The mineral formations closest to the facility were the most accessible and he extracted from them carefully, taking small quantities, working with a hand tool he had modified to function at this depth with the conversion output supplementing the tool's mechanical action in the way that the output supplemented everything at this depth. What he extracted in the first sample collection on Dive 5 fitted into a container he had built into the cylinder's exterior storage alongside the construction materials, and the container held enough of the deep origin Class 1 material to be meaningful to a surface market without being large enough to be disruptive. He brought the first samples up on Dive 5. He sold them through an online materials exchange he had identified during the research period, a platform that the territory development industry used for preliminary market testing of unusual resource finds. The platform allowed anonymous listing. He used it anonymously. He priced the samples at a level below what the system's resource assessment suggested they should command in a market where comparable material was genuinely rare, because the first transaction was not about maximizing revenue. The first transaction was about understanding the market's response to the supply. The response came in 18 hours. 3 buyers at his asking price. No negotiation. One buyer sent a follow-up message through the platform's messaging function asking if more was available and requesting information about the source territory. He did not respond to the follow-up. He went back down for the 6th dive. The group home transition completed between the 7th and 8th dives. He aged out of the placement on a Thursday, which was an administrative event rather than an emotional one in the sense that the administrative process had a date and the emotional reality of it had been present for the duration of the preparation period, woven into the timeline and the budget and the cost analysis that had accompanied every decision he had made since the ceremony. He shook the group home director's hand and she told him the workshop was available for another 30 days on an informal basis. He said thank you and meant it in a complete way of someone who understood specifically what was being given. He moved his few belongings to a rented room in the Eastern District. The room cost more than the group home and was in every other way inferior except that it was his. He set up the dive transport logistics from the new location, which was harder without the home's resources and more expensive per dive, and he calculated that the mineral sample revenue was covering the additional cost with margin remaining that was beginning to accumulate in a way the original budget analysis had not projected because the original budget analysis had not known what the floor contained. On the 9th dive he found the structures more closely than the first visit had allowed. The first visit he had landed, looked, built the initial chamber, and ascended. The subsequent dives had been primarily construction-focused, building the facility from the landing site outward, and the structures had been present in his peripheral awareness throughout those dives without being the primary subject of attention. On the 9th dive the facility was sufficiently established that he could allocate working time to the structures themselves. He moved through the outer territory with the lamp and the mapping function building the three-dimensional model that had been updating with each dive, and what the map now showed him about the structure field's organization was something he had been letting process in the background of his thinking since the first visit produced the wrong geometry observation. The structures were not randomly distributed. He had known this from the first visit. But the full extent of what the distribution meant was only visible now that the map had enough data to show him the complete arrangement across the territory rather than the portion visible from the landing site. The structures were positioned in a pattern that the system, when he directed the assessment function toward the spatial analysis, identified in a notation he had never seen before. Functional organization consistent with inhabited settlement, estimated original population capacity exceeding current mapping resolution. It had been a settlement. Not a temporary installation or a research facility or a resource extraction operation. A place where something had lived. Consistently, over time, in a way that produced the specific organization of a community rather than a project. He mapped the settlement's layout across 3 dives, moving through the outer structures systematically, cataloging what the system could read of each one from the exterior, building a picture of the settlement's purpose and scale before he approached the largest structure at the center. The largest structure was different from the others in the way that the central structure of any organized settlement was different from the structures surrounding it. Scale was the most visible difference. The response when it came was not mechanical in the standard sense. It was a conversion response, the mechanism activating not through the physical force of a pressed button or turned lever but through the energy input of the conversion output at the right point in the right sequence, as if the mechanism had been designed specifically to respond to this kind of input. The door opened inward. The interior pressure equalized with the exterior as the door swung open, a single event that the system registered as a pressure boundary event of significant duration, meaning the door had been sealed long enough that the pressure differential between interior and exterior had become measurable. He went inside. The chamber beyond the door was large. Substantially larger than the external dimensions had suggested, which meant the structure extended further into the ocean floor substrate than its above sediment height indicated. The ceiling was high enough that he could not see it clearly with the lamp at the angle of entry. The walls on every side were the deep origin structure material in its unburied form, without the sediment accumulation that covered the exterior, and in its unburied form the material had a quality that the external assessment had not conveyed, that it was not inert. He became aware of this gradually as he moved further into the chamber, the lamp showing him the dimensions of the space and the system's assessment function reading the material more thoroughly from the interior than it had been able to from the exterior. The material was responsive in a way that went beyond structural properties. When he approached the wall and his conversion output made contact with it in the passive mode, the material registered the contact and changed. Not physically. Informationally. The wall began to display something. Not light in the standard sense. A pattern. The pattern had a regularity and a structure that the system, which had been running its analysis function continuously from the moment he entered, began reading as data. The system produced a processing notification, deep origin data pattern detected, cross-reference with conversion energy signature initiated, estimated processing time 4 minutes. He stood in the center of the chamber and waited. He was very good at waiting. The system's processing completed and the output it produced appeared in his peripheral vision as a document. The document classification read, Territory Record, Pre-Transition Era, Estimated Age exceeding Current Classification Parameters. Translation function applied from Conversion Energy Cross-Reference. Confidence level, 87%. He read the territory record. He read it once all the way through without stopping. Then he read it again, more slowly, giving each section the specific focused attention that he gave to things he needed to understand accurately rather than just quickly. The 87% confidence rating on the translation function meant that some elements of the record were likely rendered in ways that approximated rather than exactly reproduced the original meaning, and he read with that uncertainty in mind, noting which elements felt precise and which felt like the translation was reaching for the nearest equivalent rather than finding the exact one. The record described the territory. Not as a resource assessment or a development survey. As a history. The builders had recorded what the territory was before they were in it and what it became while they were in it and what they understood about the relationship between the territory and the ability that the territory required to be developed. They had been in the territory for a duration the record expressed in a unit that the translation function approximated as generations, multiple generations, long enough that the settlement's organization had developed the complexity that his mapping had shown. The deep origin class 1 minerals, the geothermal vents, the specific properties of the construction material, all of these were documented in the record with a precision that told him the builders had understood what they had in a way that the surface world's current resource assessment framework did not yet have the vocabulary for. The record described the ability. Conversion. The builders called it something that the translation function rendered as the deep tongue's answer, which Kale read as a culturally specific name rather than a technical description, and the record's description of what the ability was and what it did matched the system notification's description with an accuracy that the 87% translation confidence did not account for, meaning either the translation was more accurate than the confidence rating suggested or the concepts were precise enough that even an imperfect translation preserved them. The record described why the builders left. He read this section 3 times. The record described why they left. And the record described what they left behind when they left. He documented everything. He recorded the full system output in the logging system. He photographed every section of the wall display with the documentation camera he had brought on the 15th dive specifically for this possibility. He remained in the chamber for the full available working time and then he closed the door behind him on the way out, using the mechanism sequence in reverse, and he ascended. On the surface he drove the 4 hours back to the Eastern District in the specific silence of someone who has received information that is too large to be thought about while also doing other things and who is choosing to defer the thinking until the other things are done. He arrived at the rented room. He set up the logging system. He wrote for 6 hours, everything he had read, everything the system had produced, everything he understood and everything he did not yet understand, organizing it in the sequence that would make it most useful when he returned to it. He went to sleep. He came back down on dive 16 with more materials than any previous dive. The construction in the weeks following the record discovery was different from the construction before it. Before the record he had been building from what he knew about building from the surface, adapting the principles and working within the constraints of what he could produce with the conversion output and the available materials. After the record he was building with information that had been produced by people who had built in this specific environment over multiple generations and who had documented what worked and what the specific properties of the construction material allowed. The facility grew faster. The construction configurations the record described produced results that his surface-derived approach had not been reaching because the surface-derived approach had not known about the specific relationship between conversion output angles and the material's structural response at this depth. Adjusting for what the record showed changed the efficiency of each construction session significantly. By the 20th dive the facility had expanded beyond anything he had originally projected as achievable within the resource and time constraints he had been working within. He established the defensive perimeter. Not walls in the surface development sense. The deep ocean environment did not require surface-style defensive architecture and the record had been specific about what the territory's defensive requirements actually were, which was sensor coverage and response capacity rather than physical barriers. He positioned conversion-reinforced monitoring nodes throughout the outer territory boundary, using the construction technique the record had described for integrating the monitoring function into the deep origin processed material. The nodes registered movement of the classifications of creature the system had been cataloging since the first dive. He had been fighting those creatures since the 8th dive. The first combat engagement had happened when a deep origin class creature entered the outer territory area and the monitoring node registered it, and Kale, who had been constructing the third expansion of the facility, had moved to intercept. The engagement was difficult in the specific way that first engagements with an unknown opponent were difficult, not because the opponent's capabilities exceeded his but because he had not yet calibrated his response to what the territory's combat environment required. He won. The second engagement was easier. The third easier still. By the 20th dive the territory's combat engagements had developed into something closer to a routine than a challenge, which was not complacency. Complacency was not something he had available in this environment, but a calibration, an understanding of the specific relationship between his conversion output at this depth and the specific capabilities of the opponent classifications the territory contained. The cores the deep origin class creatures dropped were not standard monster cores. The system registered them with the same exceeding surface classification parameters notation it had applied to the mineral formations and the geothermal vents. He extracted them and cataloged them and added them to the documentation he was building of the territory's resources. He did not sell them. The mineral samples had demonstrated that the surface market would pay significant attention to deep origin class 1 materials. The cores would draw more attention than the mineral samples and more attention than he was ready for until the facility's development and the formal registration of the territory operation were further along. On the surface the revenue from the mineral sales was covering the dive costs with accumulating margin. He had identified the formal registration pathway through the Territory Development Authority's public documentation, a process that required verified resource documentation and a development plan submission, and the documentation he had been building since the first dive was approaching the threshold where the formal submission was viable. He estimated 2 months. In the market the deep origin class 1 mineral sales from the anonymous exchange listings had attracted attention that was no longer confined to individual buyers. 3 of the major territory development companies had separately initiated investigations into the source of the unusual material supply. He knew this not because he was monitoring the investigations but because the territory development industry's public information channels, which he had been following since before the ceremony, were carrying discussion of the market anomaly in terms specific enough that the investigations were evident to anyone reading carefully. Someone was tracing it. He did not know yet how far the trace had progressed. What he knew was that the trace was happening and that it would eventually reach the territory registry, and from there his name and from there his ability classification, which was registered as pressure tolerance because the supplementary notification that had corrected the classification to pressure conversion was not in the public registry and had not been, as far as he had been able to determine, transmitted to the assessment database. The person investigating would find an entry that said pressure tolerance and an ocean floor territory and would face the same inconsistency that he had considered when he first received the supplementary notification. The inconsistency would produce either a correct inference or an incorrect one. He could not control which. He continued working. On Dive 21 he was in the interior of the main structure, the central chamber where the wall had displayed the territory record, working on the conversion integration project he had begun on the 18th dive, when the monitoring nodes at the eastern perimeter registered a contact. He stopped working. The contact was larger than any creature the system had catalogued in the territory. Not marginally larger. Significantly larger in the specific sense of a monitoring system encountering something whose scale exceeded the parameters it had been set to report. The node's alert was not the standard alert signature that the Deep Origin class creature encounters produced. It was a different signature, a new signature that the system did not have an existing category for and was attempting to categorize in real time. He looked at the alert. The system's categorization attempt was running and had not completed. The notation in his peripheral vision showed the categorization process as active with no completion estimate. The monitoring node was transmitting continuous data and the system was processing the continuous data, and the categorization was taking longer than any previous categorization had taken because the system was encountering something it had never encountered before and was building the category as it processed rather than matching to an existing one that he moved from the main structure toward the eastern perimeter. Not fast. Not slow. With the specific quality of movement that the territory had produced in him across 21 dives, the quality of someone moving through an environment they had learned and were not afraid of, which was different from moving through an environment without concern. He was concerned. He moved with the concern present and the movement unhurried. The system categorization completed when he was 50 meters from the eastern perimeter boundary. The notation appeared in his peripheral vision. Origin class, pre-transition era entity, classification pending cross-reference with territory record data. He stopped walking. Pre-transition era. He stood in 4 kilometers of ocean darkness with the lamp lighting the 30 meters around him, and he read the notation again and thought about the territory record and what it had said, specifically and precisely, in the sections he had read 3 times. It had said the builders left. It had said they left because of what was coming. It had not said what happened after they left. He walked the remaining 50 meters to the perimeter boundary. What was on the other side of the boundary was present in the lamp's range, and the lamp's range was not sufficient to illuminate it fully. The territory record and what it had said, specifically and precisely, in the sections he had read 3 times. It had said the builders left. It had said they left because of what was coming. It had not said what happened after they left. He walked the remaining 50 meters to the perimeter boundary. What was on the other side of the boundary was present in the lamp's range, and the lamp's range was not sufficient to illuminate it fully. What he could see was enough to confirm that the system's pre-transition era entity notation was the most accurate description available, and that no existing category in the surface world's monster database or the territory development industry's threat assessment framework applied to what he was looking at. It had a form. Organized, intentional, operating with the specific quality of something that had chosen to be here rather than something that had arrived here by the processes that moved organisms through ecosystems. It was looking at him. He turned off the lamp. In the complete darkness of 4 kilometers of ocean floor, he and whatever was on the other side of the perimeter boundary stood in the presence of each other for a duration that the logging system later told him was 14 minutes and 32 seconds. He stood still. It did not move. Neither of them produced anything that the system registered as an aggressive action or a threat display. 14 minutes and 32 seconds was a long time to stand in absolute darkness with something you had no category for. He stood still. Then the entity moved. Not toward him. Toward the perimeter boundary surface. It approached the boundary and pressed something against the exterior surface of the boundary wall he had built, the conversion processed material that the deep origin processing had made into something the system classified as beyond parametric assessment range. It pressed what it was carrying against the wall and held it there. It was not attacking the boundary. It was showing him something. He reactivated the lamp, slowly and with the lamp angled to avoid direct illumination of the entity, which felt appropriate in a way he could not have explained in technical terms but that the territory record's description of the builder's relationship with this environment had prepared him for in general terms. He looked at what the entity was pressing against the boundary wall, the system's cross-reference process, which had been running since the categorization completed, finished at almost exactly the same moment he understood what he was looking at. The cross-reference result appeared in his peripheral vision as a document produced by comparing the entity's classification data against the territory record's content. Both pieces of information said the same thing. The territory record had described what the builders left behind when they left. They had not left only the structures and the record and the settlement's organization and the resource deposits. They had left something that was not a thing but a presence. Something that remained in the territory after the builders departed and that the record, in the sections he had read 3 times, described with a word that the translation function had rendered as keeper, with a note that the translation confidence for this specific term was 62%. Meaning the system was not certain keeper was the right word but was certain it was the nearest equivalent in the available translation framework. What the entity was pressing against the wall was an object whose surface pattern matched a specific element of the territory record's documentation. Not similar. Matched. The same pattern. Pressed against the conversion-processed boundary wall from the outside, held there with what the monitoring nodes read as a deliberate and sustained application of force, displayed for him to see. He understood. He had read the record. He knew who had built this place. He had not known until this moment that they had left someone to wait for him. He reached the perimeter boundary control panel he had built into the facility's monitoring system, a simple interface designed to allow manual override of the boundary's integrity at specific points. He looked at the interface for a moment. Then he opened a section of the boundary. Not large. Large enough. He spoke into the water, out loud, because speaking helped him organize what he was trying to communicate and because the entity was not going to understand the words and the words were for him rather than for the entity and the logging system was recording everything and he would want the record of what he said when he said it. He said, "I read the record. I know who built this place. I did not know you were still here." The entity responded. What it produced was not sound in the standard sense. The monitoring system registered a signal that it could not categorize with existing signal parameters and began a new categorization process. The conversion output he was generating passively at full depth responded to the entity's signal in a way he could feel, the ability resonating with whatever the entity had produced in the way that two things built from the same underlying principle resonated when they were close enough. The system's translation function initiated without him directing it to, the notation appeared, processing entity communication, cross-referencing with territory record linguistic data, translation bridge construction initiated. Estimated completion 3 minutes. That he looked at the entity through the opening in the boundary. It was looking back at him. 3 minutes. That he had waited 3 hours on the first ascent to understand what was at the bottom of his territory. He had waited 21 dives to open the door in the central structure. That he had stood in absolute darkness for 14 minutes and 32 seconds without moving because stillness was what the situation required. 3 minutes was not a long time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Anime Void for more amazing anime and manhwa recaps. What did you think about this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions.